"Get off my range," Colonel Marcus Whitmore said at once. Flat final. His finger pointed toward the gate like she was a trespasser he'd already forgotten. Every elite operator on that firing line heard it. 31 decorated soldiers, rangers, SEAL veterans, and not one of them said a word. She picked up her rifle case without a syllable, without a tremor. She turned and walked away under the Arizona sun, while the most accomplished marksman in the U.S. military stood there and let it happen. Nobody knew her name yet. By sunset, nobody would forget it. If this story grabs you, subscribe to our channel and follow along to the very end, then drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The rifle case was old. That was the first thing people noticed about her. Not her face, not her posture, not the way she moved through the crowd of operators like water finding its way between stones. Case itself was the thing that caught your eye, a battered hard-shell Pelican. The kind that had been dropped out of helicopters and dragged through desert sand and salt water, enough times that the original color was anybody's guess. It had no manufacturer's stickers, no unit insignia. Just scratches and dents and a few pieces of worn duct tape reinforcing a hinge that had been repaired in the field at T. Lee. She carried it like it weighed nothing. That should have told Marcus Whitmore everything he needed to know. But Marcus Whitmore was the kind of man who had already decided what he was looking at before he'd finished looking. He stood at the edge of Redstone Tactical's primary firing deck and watched her cross the lot with the practiced eye of a man who had spent 30 years evaluating operators. He had a gift for reading people, or so he believed. He could spot a shooter by the way they walked. He could identify a veteran by the way their eyes moved. He had built his entire professional identity around the idea that he knew, within 30 seconds, exactly what kind of person was standing in front of him. The woman crossing his parking lot was nobody. Faded tactical pants one shade north of gray. A long-sleeve shirt that had been washed too many times. No rank, no patches, no visible credentials on anything she was wearing. Her hair was pulled back tight in a way that suggested function over thought, and she wore no sunglasses despite the Arizona sun hammering down hard enough to make the asphalt shimmer. She was average height, average build. She carried a small go bag over one shoulder and the rifle case in her opposite hand, and she walked at a pace that was unhurried to the point of being almost casual. She didn't look around. She didn't check her phone. She didn't ask anyone for directions. She just moved toward the firing line like she knew exactly where she was going. Whitmore intercepted her before she reached the equipment staging area. "Hold on." She stopped without flinching. She turned toward him with a steadiness that should have registered as a warning. Her eyes were calm, not nervous calm, not pretending to be calm, but the kind of calm that lives below thinking, that gets built through years of situations where panic costs lives. "Can I help you?" was quiet, not soft quiet. There was a difference. Soft implied something that could be pushed over. Quiet implied something that didn't need to be loud to be heard. Whitmore glanced down at her case, then back up at her face. "This is a restricted evaluation area," he said. "Active military personnel and credentialed contractors only. What's your purpose on this range?" "I'm assigned to firing position 7, she said. "Senior Chief Carter." She said it the way someone states a fact that requires no commentary. Not defensive, not apologetic, just the information offered cleanly. Whitmore's jaw moved. Something behind his eyes shifted, the small recalculation that happens when a person's reality bumps into their expectation and the expectation wins anyway. "Carter," he repeated. "Yes, sir." He looked her over again. The no-rank uniform, the battered case, the absence of any external signal that this woman belonged at a range where the most elite precision shooters in the American military had assembled for a classified evaluation exercise. "Who assigned you to this range?" "Came down through SOCOM," she said. Coordination was handled by General Hayes's office. The name didn't move him the way it should have, or rather it moved him, but in the wrong direction. Because Whitmore had been a colonel long enough to develop the particular blind spot that sometimes comes with rank, the belief that your chain of command makes decisions through you, not around you. "General Hayes's office didn't communicate any additional personnel to my command," he said. "Until I receive proper clearance from my chain, you're not authorized to be on this range." "I can show you my orders," she said, and she moved to reach into the go bag. He held up a hand. "What you can do," he said, "is stand by until I've had a chance to verify the situation through my channels. In the meantime, you are not to approach the firing line." She stopped reaching for the go bag. She looked at him for a moment, that same steady, unreadable look, and then she nodded. "Understood," she said. He walked back toward his command station, feeling like he'd handled something. The satisfaction was small but real, order maintained. Unknown variable quarantined, his range, his rules, his control. What he missed, what he would spend the next several hours replaying in painful detail, was that she hadn't argued. She hadn't pushed back, hadn't invoked the general's name again, hadn't reached for her phone to make a call that would have immediately resolved the entire situation. She had simply stood there with her old rifle case and her quiet eyes and waited, which, if Whitmore had been as good at reading people as he believed, would have told him exactly what kind of person he was dealing with. The Redstone Tactical Range in western Arizona existed for one specific purpose: to push the absolute ceiling of long-range precision shooting. The terrain was engineered by nature and refined by military planners to create conditions that replicated the worst environments an operator might encounter in actual combat. The desert basin extended nearly 3 kilometers in its longest axis. Elevation changes, thermal columns, unpredictable crosswinds channeled through narrow gaps in the surrounding ridgeline. The range was legitimately punishing in a way that most civilian shooting facilities could not replicate. Even experienced shooters who came to Redstone for the first time were sometimes caught off guard by how different the wind behaved here compared to anywhere else they'd operated. That day, the wind was particularly vicious. It came in 2 directions at once, which wasn't meteorologically impossible but was operationally infuriating. A shooter trying to dial for a wind call at the 1,000-meter mark would find a completely different condition by the time the bullet crossed the valley floor. Thermal effect added another layer. The heat rising off the desert created micro-distortions that bent lines of sight in ways that made even quality optics feel unreliable. First shooter online was Staff Sergeant Derek Foley, Army Rangers, and 2 combat deployments, a reputation in his unit as the best distance shooter anyone had ever seen in person. He was a genuine talent, methodical, patient, technically precise. He had spent 3 months preparing for this evaluation specifically. His equipment was dialed. His spotter was one of the best in the business. He had studied the Redstone environmental reports and believed he understood what he was walking into. He put 4 rounds into the target area before his spotter admitted the wind had beat them on all 4. 23 inches left, the spotter said quietly. Wind shifted while it was still in the air. Foley came off his scope without expression. He reset his position and went through the calculations again. On the next string, he hit the target once, out of 4 attempts. 2,000 meters in that wind, 1 for 4 was not a failure. It was a respectable result. But the evaluation standard was higher than respectable. The evaluation standard was the reason they were all here, to find out who could operate beyond the edge of what was considered achievable under combat conditions. The results from the first 3 shooters told a story that made Whitmore uncomfortable. He had selected these men personally. He had reviewed their service records, their qualification scores, their unit recommendations. He had been confident that today's demonstration would show the command what American Special Operations marksmanship looked like at its highest expression. Instead, the wind was making his best shooters look like they were learning. He stood behind the firing line, with his arms crossed, and his face locked into the expression he used when he refused to let anyone see what he was actually feeling. Command team from SOCOM had flown in for this evaluation. Officers whose approval he had been quietly working toward for 2 years. Men whose opinions determined careers. They were watching the scores, doing the math, drawing their own conclusions. None of it was landing the way Whitmore had planned. "We're going to need to adjust the evaluation parameters," his executive officer, Major Kyle Trent, said carefully. Trent was good at carefully. It was how he had survived 3 years working directly for Whitmore. "We're not adjusting anything," Whitmore said. "Sir, the wind conditions today are significantly beyond what was forecast. The environmental variance alone. Every shooter on this range knew the conditions before they arrived. Conditions are part of the evaluation. Nobody adjusts for real-world conditions in the field." Trent nodded and said nothing else. Whitmore watched the next shooter go prone and begin his preparation. He checked the scoreboard. He checked the time. He thought briefly about the woman with the old rifle case who was sitting somewhere behind the admin building, waiting for a clearance call he had not yet made. He had not yet made it because making it would have required him to explain why he'd stopped her in the first place, and that explanation might not reflect entirely well on his judgment. He put the thought away and focused on the range. Her name, before it became classified, was Emily Marie Carter. She grew up in a small town in eastern Tennessee that most people who hadn't grown up there had no reason to visit. Her father was a diesel mechanic who spent his weekends in a deer stand with a rifle he'd owned since before Emily was born. She was shooting before she was 10, not because she was pushed toward it, but because she asked to, and because something in the mechanics of it appealed to her in a way she couldn't fully articulate even now, decades later. The relationship between breathing and stillness, the way time compressed around a long shot, the absolute honesty of it, Either the bullet went where you intended it to go or it didn't, and there was no arguing with the result. She enlisted at 19. The recruiter had been visibly skeptical. Not hostile. Exactly more the kind of polite confusion that comes from encountering something that doesn't match a template. She was small, she was female, and she wanted to know what the fastest path to special operations training looked like. He explained that the path she was describing didn't exist for women. She thanked him and asked about the Naval Special Warfare Pipeline specifically. She qualified for the Naval Special Warfare Support Activity Program, which was not SEAL Team proper but was not far from it. She was part of the first group of women to complete an assessment process that had historically filtered out most men who attempted it. She did not complete it by being the fastest or the strongest, she completed it by refusing to stop, by making every decision from the first day to the last, as if stopping was not a concept that had any application to her situation. She became a sniper the way most things in her life had happened through a combination of native talent and a work ethic that bordered on pathological. Her first long-range qualification course was run by a chief petty officer named Raymond Estrada, who had been training military snipers for 15 years and claimed he could identify real potential within the first week. He identified it in Emily Carter within the first 2 days, and then said nothing about it to anyone for 6 weeks because he didn't want to interfere with how she was developing. On her final qualification course, she made a shot at 2,200 meters under conditions that her instructor later described in a report that was immediately classified as beyond the theoretical performance envelope of the platform she was using. She simply called it a good day. Her call sign came from the third deployment. The details of that deployment were classified at a level that meant Whitmore would need different clearances than he currently held to access them. What was not classified was the outcome. 12 operators came home who might not have otherwise, and the enemy commander whose network had been responsible for 7 American deaths over the previous 18 months was neutralized at a range that the official incident report declined to specify. Phantom 6, she had not chosen the call sign. Call signs rarely got chosen. They got earned, or they got assigned by the people around you who needed something to call you in the dark. In her case, it had started as a piece of dark humor, the 6th member of a team that only had 5 people, a presence nobody could account for, the shot that came from a position the enemy had already cleared. Stuck because she kept earning it, and now she was sitting on the tailgate of an old military truck in the Redstone Tactical Parking Area, watching the desert, waiting for a colonel she'd never met to verify her orders through channels he should have trusted from the first moment she gave him the general's name. She wasn't angry. People who asked her later, and there were people who asked, because what happened that day became the kind of story that gets passed around in certain circles. People who asked whether she had been angry usually seemed confused by her answer. She said she'd been curious. She'd been curious about what would happen next. What happened next was that the evaluation began falling apart in ways that went beyond just the shooting scores. By the second hour, 3 of Whitmore's hand-selected operators had formally requested a pause in the evaluation due to equipment issues. 2 of them genuinely had equipment issues, a scope mounting problem that had come loose under recoil, a wind meter that was giving inconsistent readings. Third was less clear. His request came in after 2 consecutive complete misses at the 1,800-meter line, and the equipment issue he cited was, in the careful language he used, environmental factors affecting optic clarity. Potter, who had been quietly professional throughout, didn't contradict him. Whitmore approved all 3 pauses through clenched teeth. The SOCOM command team was gathered about 40 meters behind the firing line, and Whitmore was acutely aware of their presence, the way a man becomes aware of a headache. It had been there for a while before it became impossible to ignore. Brigadier General Patricia Ruiz was among them. She was the only woman in the group, and she was, by rank and reputation, the most consequential person at Redstone that day. Her evaluation of the program would go directly to the Special Operations community's assessment of whether Whitmore's approach to this kind of training was worth the investment. She was watching everything with the focused attention of someone who was going to have opinions about it later. Major Trent appeared at Whitmore's elbow again. "Colonel, clearance request you put in for the additional personnel, have you received a response yet?" Whitmore looked at him. "I'm managing a training evaluation, Major." "I understand, sir. It's just the individual in question has been in the parking area for almost 2 hours now, and I'm getting some questions from the support staff about." "Tell the support staff to focus on their jobs." "Yes, sir." Pause. "It's also I did a quick name check on Carter, Senior Chief Emily Carter, and there are some flags that..." "What kind of flags?" Trent looked like a man choosing his words with extraordinary care. Classified access flags, he said. The kind that require verification before I can tell you what they're for. Whitmore stared at him. The silence between them had weight. Make the verification call, Whitmore said quietly. I already did, sir. Trent's voice dropped another register. They're still processing my clearance to receive the information. The implication settled in Whitmore's chest like something cold. If a name check returned classified access flags that required additional clearance to view, it meant the person attached to that name had done things, or been in places, or held a role, existed at a level above what most military personnel were authorized to know. It didn't happen with support staff. It didn't happen with admin personnel or contractors or observers. It happened with people who had operated in environments that the military had very specific reasons to keep quiet. He looked toward the parking area. She was still there. Still sitting on the tailgate, still watching the desert. He thought about the way she had said her rate and name. Senior Chief Carter. No agitation, no escalation, no indication that she thought any of this was even slightly unreasonable. Just quiet, just waiting. A cold, unspecific unease began working its way through Whitmore's chest. He pushed it aside. Keep monitoring the situation, he told Trent, and get the next shooter ready. The next shooter was a Marine Raider, Gunnery Sergeant Marco Salinas, and he was very good. He settled into position with the kind of economy of movement that comes from doing something thousands of times. Spotter was equally precise. They communicated in a shorthand that had been developed over 2 years of working together, and it showed tight, efficient, no wasted breath. Salinas made his first shot at 1,950 meters and hit cleanly. A small ripple of response went through the observers behind the line. Whitmore felt himself unclench slightly. Then the wind shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that was visible or that anyone would describe as sudden. It just moved the way wind does in desert terrain, following contours and thermals in patterns that could take years to understand fully. Salinas and his spotter recalculated, took an extra 90 seconds on the data, dialed the adjustment. The next shot missed by what the spotter estimated at 14 inches. Salinas didn't react visibly. He went back through the process, recalculated again. Third shot hit, but the margin was closer than it should have been for a shooter of his quality. He knew it. His spotter knew it. The gap between where the shot landed and where it needed to land was small enough that in a different context it would have been acceptable. But in this evaluation, in front of this audience, small margins were not enough. He came off his rifle after the string and looked at his spotter for a long moment. Wind's doing something I don't have a number for, Salinas said. Spotter nodded slowly. Yeah, was all he said. Whitmore heard it from 4 meters away. He said nothing. But somewhere in the back of his mind the unease was growing legs. She heard the shooting from where she sat. Carried across the desert the way sound does in open terrain thinned by distance but still present, the sharp report of rifles at a range, followed by the longer silence of waiting for impact. She had spent enough time listening to that particular sequence, from enough different positions, from a hide, from a spotter's scope, from the compressed heat of a target building, 3 kilometers from a partner she couldn't see but trusted with her life, that the sounds had meaning to her in a way they didn't for most people. She could tell, from the timing and the rhythm, that the shooting wasn't going well. She did not feel satisfaction about this. That would have required her to want something bad for the people on that line, and she didn't. They were good shooters, probably. This was a hard range on a hard day, and being a good shooter did not automatically mean being able to crack a 2,000-meter solution in wind that was rewriting itself every 40 seconds. That required something different, something that took longer to develop than most people understood. She thought about Raymond Estrada, her first sniper's instructor, who had once told her that a long-range shot in difficult conditions was not a technical problem. It was a conversation. You were communicating with the environment. You had to listen before you talked. Most shooters, he said, wanted to talk first. They came to the firing line with their solution already built, or already committed to their calculations. And then they fought the environment when the environment didn't cooperate. The ones who were dangerous, really dangerous, were the ones who listened, who waited, who let the wind tell them what it was going to do before they asked anything of it. She thought about that now, sitting on the tailgate, listening to the distant reports carry across the desert. Listening to the environment tell its story. Her phone buzzed once. Text from a number she recognized. 2 words were close. She put the phone back in her pocket and looked at the sky. The moment that changed the day happened at 14:47. She knew the time because she checked her watch the moment she heard the vehicle, and the time lodged in her memory the way times tended to during significant events. The way a person who has operated in high-stakes environments learns to timestamp things automatically, Because later there will be questions, and the answers need to be accurate. The vehicle was a black SUV, government plates, and it came in fast. Not recklessly fast, deliberately fast, the kind of pace that communicates urgency without communication. Stopped near the admin building. Two people got out of the front. Military bearing, civilian clothes, the particular combination that meant senior staff traveling informally. Then the rear door opened. General Daniel Hayes, commander of U. Special Operations Command. She recognized him immediately, the way she would have recognized the Secretary of Defense or the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, not because she had spent time in his presence, but because there are people in any military structure whose faces you know before you've ever been in the same room with them. He was a large man who moved economically, the kind of physical presence that didn't require demonstration. He looked 60 but moved 40. He wore no medals in the field. His office, she'd been told, had medals enough to cover a wall, and the wall existed because the regulations required it, not because he valued the display. He stopped outside the vehicle and looked around the range. His gaze found her within 10 seconds. She stood up from the tailgate. He walked toward her without breaking stride, which meant the two aides who had been moving toward the admin building had to change direction and follow him instead. She stood straight and waited. "Senior Chief Carter," he said, when he was close enough that only she and the nearest aide could hear. "General Hayes," she said, "you're not on the firing line. I was removed from the range by the range commander, sir." Hayes looked at her for a moment. His expression did not change exactly, but something moved behind it. "Who's the range commander?" "Colonel Marcus Whitmore, sir." Another pause. "Longer, come with me," he said. And Emily Carter picked up her rifle case and followed General Hayes toward the firing line, and Colonel Marcus Whitmore, who had been watching the SUV's arrival from the command station, was about to have the worst afternoon of his career. Whitmore saw them coming from 60 meters away and felt his stomach drop in a way that he had not felt since his first combat deployment, when a mission he'd been certain was solid began coming apart in real time, and there was nothing to do but keep moving and try to control the damage. He recognized Hayes immediately. You didn't rise to colonel without knowing what the SOCOM commander looked like. What he could not immediately process was the woman walking beside him, the woman with the old rifle case. His brain performed a rapid, desperate reassessment that lasted approximately the length of time it took Hayes to cross the remaining distance. She wasn't just verified. Hayes had come himself. "Colonel Whitmore," Hayes said, stopping in front of him. Whitmore came to attention. "General, this is Senior Chief Carter. She's been assigned to your evaluation. I understand she's been waiting in the parking area." Whitmore opened his mouth. He was prepared for this. He'd been preparing for it, at some level, since Trent had come back with the news about the clearance flags. He had an answer ready, a professional, measured explanation of his decision. What came out was, "There was a clearance issue I needed to verify, sir." Hayes looked at him. "Her orders came through my office," Hayes said. "I understand that now, sir. Did you ask to see her orders?" Pause. "I was in the process of verification through my channel." "Did you ask to see her orders, Colonel?" The question the second time was not a question. Whitmore stood in the silence of it for 2 seconds that felt much longer. "No, sir," he said. Hayes nodded. He didn't make anything of it, didn't editorialize, didn't let the moment expand beyond what it was. He simply received the answer and moved forward. "Senior Chief Carter is here to participate in today's evaluation," he said. "Her position is firing station 7. He looked at Whitmore steadily. "I trust that won't be a problem." "No, sir," Whitmore said. Hayes held his gaze for one more beat, then turned toward the firing line. And Whitmore, standing in the desert with his assumptions in pieces around him, looked at the woman who had spent 2 hours on his tailgate because he had been too certain of what he was seeing to look again. She met his eyes for exactly a moment, then she walked past him to the firing line. The operators nearby, Foley, Salinas, 3 others who had been watching the exchange, parted for her automatically, the way a formation adjusts when something moves through it with authority. She set her case down at Station 7. She crouched and opened it. In whatever conversation Redstone Tactical Range had been having all afternoon, it was about to change. Case clicked open. That sound, small, mechanical, completely unremarkable, somehow cut through every other noise on that range. The wind, the residual conversations, the distant thud of a failed shot still echoing off the valley wall. All of it fell back, and the click of Emily Carter's rifle case opening at Station 7 became the thing everyone heard. Nobody moved toward her, but nobody looked away either. Gunnery Sergeant Marco Salinas was closest. He'd been running a cleaning cloth along his bolt assembly, going through the motions of maintenance with the kind of automatic focus that gives a man something to do with his hands when his mind is working on something else. He watched her from the corner of his eye with the particular attention of someone pretending not to pay attention. What he saw made him slow down. She didn't rush. She didn't perform. She didn't look around to see who was watching. Didn't arrange herself in a way that communicated anything about what she was capable of. She simply removed the components of her rifle from the case, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had assembled this specific weapon so many times that thinking about it would only slow her down. The rifle itself was not what he expected. He'd assumed, for reasons he couldn't entirely justify, something modified something that wore its capability on the outside. It announced itself through optics and chassis, and the kind of aftermarket work that said this was built for something specific. What she pulled from the case was clean, serious, and looked like it had been used enough to know exactly what it was for. No unnecessary additions, nothing cosmetic. The scope was large and precise and mounted with zero-wasted hardware. Salinas set down his cleaning cloth. Staff Sergeant Derek Foley appeared at his shoulder. "Is that what I think it is?" Foley said quietly. "Yeah," Salinas said. They looked at each other. Neither of them said anything else. They didn't need to. Platform she was running was not standard issue, was not what any of them had brought to this range, and the fact that she was running it at all meant someone, somewhere, had decided she was the appropriate person to put behind it. That decision had not been made lightly. 20 meters back, Colonel Whitmore was watching all of it and telling himself he wasn't. He had a radio in his hand that he wasn't using, and a scoreboard on the monitor in front of him that he wasn't reading. His executive officer, Major Trent, had made himself quiet and peripheral in the way that good staff officers do when they sense that their commander needs room to process something difficult. The general was speaking with the SOCOM command team near the observation platform, close enough that Whitmore could see the conversation but not hear it. He was very aware of not being in that conversation. He was also very aware of what had just happened in front of 31 operators, and a general officer the kind of awareness that sits in your sternum and radiates outward, and does not respond to rationalization. He had made a call. The call had been wrong. The distance between those two facts was not something he could close by explaining himself, because the only explanation available required him to account for why he had looked at Emily Carter and seen someone who didn't belong, and that accounting led to a place he wasn't ready to go. He focused on the range. She was prone now, her body settled into position with the kind of stillness that takes years to develop. Her spotter, a quiet, compact man named Torres, who had arrived with Hayes's team and set up beside her without introduction, was already behind his scope, already calling preliminary wind data in a voice low enough that Whitmore couldn't catch the specifics. "Wind's still doing that thing," Foley said. "Half to Salinas, half to the air." He meant the double direction problem that had been torturing every shooter online since the exercise began. The way the wind came from the northwest at the firing position, and then turned in the valley and came from a completely different angle by the time it reached the target line. It was the reason the scores were where they were. It was the reason the SOCOM team's expressions had been getting progressively tighter over the last 2 hours. Salinas nodded. "Let's see how she reads it." Torres spoke first. "Primary left to right, 4 to 6 miles per hour at the line. Secondary shift in the valley winds coming around at roughly 40 degrees different from the primary. Thermal column at about 800 meters is adding an upward component. Variable. Changes every 30 to 40 seconds. Emily didn't respond immediately. She was looking through her scope, but her breathing was slow and she wasn't doing anything with her hands. She was listening. To Torres, yes, but also to something else. The way experienced shooters listen to an environment that is telling them things that instruments can't fully capture. "How long has the thermal been consistent?" she asked. "About 20-minute cycles," Torres said. "Get stronger as the day heats. Right now we're probably 2/3 up the cycle, so it'll peak in about 7 minutes and then drop." "Roughly, yeah. Then we wait 7 minutes." Torres looked at her. "The evaluation window is." "I know what the window is," she said. Not sharply, just clearly. 7 minutes. Torres nodded and went back to his scope. Behind the line, Foley leaned toward Salinas and said, very quietly, "She's waiting out the thermal." Salinas said nothing. He was watching her with an expression that had moved past curiosity into something more careful. He had been shooting at distance for 11 years. He had worked with some of the best spotters and instructors in the military. He had never seen anyone, in a formal evaluation context, with the clock running and command eyes on them, simply decide to wait for the environment to cooperate. Most shooters under that kind of pressure shot, because not shooting felt like failing. Because every second you didn't pull the trigger was a second the observers could interpret as hesitation or uncertainty or inability. She lay there and breathed and did nothing. It was the most confident thing anyone on that range had seen all day. Whitmore couldn't stand it. He walked to where Major Trent was standing with the evaluation clipboard and said in a tone that was controlled but tight, "How much time has she been on the line without firing?" Trent checked his watch. 4 minutes, sir. The evaluation protocol requires engagement with... Protocol specifies engagement within the evaluation window, sir. The window is 20 minutes. Whitmore stared at the clipboard like it had personally offended him. "She's burning time," he said. Trent said nothing. "She's on a range with SOCOM command watching, and she's lying there doing nothing." Trent still said nothing, which was its own kind of answer, and Whitmore knew it, and knowing it made the thing in his sternum worse. He almost walked to the line. He almost said something. He was 3 steps into the intention before something stopped him, not wisdom. Exactly, more the memory of Hayes's eyes when he'd answered the question about the orders. The look that didn't editorialize. The look that simply recorded. He stopped walking. He crossed his arms and waited. The 7 minutes felt like 30. Torres said quietly, thermals peaking. Emily exhaled slowly. "Yeah," she said. "Give me 30 seconds. She was watching something through her scope that nobody else could see from where they stood. The way mirage moves in a thermal column, the heat shimmer that experienced distance shooters learned to read the way a sailor reads. Water was telling her something specific about the column's behavior at this moment in its cycle. She was having the conversation Estrada had described to her 15 years ago. Listening before talking. 20 seconds passed. "Wind in the valley just shifted," Torres said. His voice was very even, coming more from the south now. "Maybe 30 degrees off the earlier red." "I've got it," she said. 5 seconds. Then she fired. The report was sharp and immediate, and then there was the particular silence that follows a long-range shot, the gap between the trigger and the outcome, the distance the bullet has to travel before anyone knows anything. On a 2,000-meter range, that gap was real, long enough to breathe, long enough for doubt. The impact sound came back across the valley like a clean metallic note. Torres said, "Hit center." Nobody on that firing line moved for a full second. Foley said, very quietly, "Holy." "Second target," Emily said. She was already cycling, already resettling. Torres gave her the updated wind call without being asked, and she incorporated it without visible adjustment, no dialing, no recalculation that anyone watching could observe. Whatever math she was running it somewhere that didn't require external confirmation. She fired again. "Hit," Torres said. "Left edge but solid. Wind shifted early," she said. "Thermal dropped faster than the 20-minute cycle suggested. About 40 seconds faster. I'll adjust." She adjusted. Whatever that meant, whatever internal process produced the change, the next shot landed center again. 3 shots, 3 hits. At a range and in conditions that had been producing 1 hit for every 4 attempts from shooters who had been preparing for this evaluation for months. Firing line was silent, not the silence of people who had nothing to say. The silence of people with too much to say and no immediate framework for saying it. Salinas set down the cleaning cloth he'd been holding for the last 10 minutes without using. "Okay," he said softly. That was all. Just okay, but the way he said it covered considerable territory. Brigadier General Patricia Ruiz had been watching from the observation platform with the focused patience of someone who had learned, through long experience. The most important things at any evaluation happened not in the official results but in the unscripted moments between them. She had watched Whitmore's face when Hayes arrived. She had watched the exchange at the entrance. She had watched Whitmore almost walk toward the firing line when Emily was waiting out the thermal. She had watched him stop himself. She wrote 3 words in the small notebook she carried. Then she looked back at the range. Emily was setting up for her 4th shot. What happened over the next 40 minutes would become the kind of story that travels through a community by word of mouth, gaining detail and losing nothing essential, until it exists as a fixed point in the institutional memory of everyone who moves through that world. Kind of story that gets told in briefing rooms and training facilities and mess halls, told accurately by the people who were there, and with embellishment by the people who weren't, but always told. Because some things that happen in the presence of real excellence refuse to stay private. She shot 11 times in that evaluation window, 9 hits. 2 near misses that Torres marked as within acceptable margin given the wind variance. Was a technical way of saying that the shots had been correctly calculated, and the wind had moved in the final 100 meters of flight in a way that could not have been predicted from the firing position. 9 for 11, at 2,000 meters in conditions that the range's own environmental sensors would later record as the most technically challenging of the year. The other shooters had been averaging 1 for 4. Foley did the math in his head and then wished he hadn't, because the math was uncomfortable. Not because it diminished him, he was honest enough with himself to understand that what he was watching was something that existed at a different level than where he operated, and being outperformed by that level was not shameful. It was uncomfortable because it clarified something about the previous 2 hours that he hadn't been examining directly. She had been sitting in the parking lot while this was happening. She had been removed from this range on this day, in these conditions by a man who had looked at her and decided she didn't belong. And during every shot that had gone wide, during every spotter call that came back with a miss, during every moment of collective frustration that had been building on the firing line since the first string, she had been out there in the desert heat, waiting. He thought about that for a while. He didn't say anything about it to Salinas or to anyone else. But he thought about it, and it did something to the way he was going to think about evaluation from that point forward. General Hayes let the shooting finish before he spoke. He waited until Emily had cleared her rifle and Torres had closed his notebook and the last impact report had been recorded in the evaluation log. Then he walked to the front of the line, in front of all of them, in front of the operators, the support staff, the SOCOM command team, and he stood there for a moment, in the way that senior leaders stand when they are about to say something that they want people to remember exactly. "I want to talk about what this evaluation was actually designed to test," he said. The range was completely quiet. Every one of you was told this was a long-range shooting assessment. Precision marksmanship under adverse conditions. And that's true, that is what it is. He paused. It's also a leadership evaluation, and I don't mean for the shooters. He let that sit. Whitmore, standing 6 meters to Hayes' left, felt it land on him with the precision of a well-placed round. "I want to talk about decision-making," Hayes continued. "Specifically about the decisions we make in the first 30 seconds of encountering something we didn't expect. Because in this community, in special operations, in any high-stakes environment, the 30-second judgment call is the one that determines outcomes. And the 30-second judgment call is almost always made on incomplete information." He looked at the group, not at Whitmore specifically, just at the group. "The shooter at Station 7 was assigned to this evaluation through my office. Her orders were legitimate, her credentials were valid, and she has operational history that most of the people on this range would need a higher clearance level to read." A pause. "She was removed from this range before firing a single shot, based on a judgment call made in approximately 30 seconds. Nobody moved. That judgment call," Hayes said, "cost this evaluation 2 hours of her time on the line. Time that, as you've now seen, was not without value." He stopped speaking and looked at the scoreboard. He didn't say Whitmore's name. He didn't point. He didn't direct the statement at any individual explicitly. He didn't need to. In a gathering of military professionals, the weight of a senior officer's displeasure does not require a name to find its target. Whitmore stood with his hands at his sides and his face composed and took it. He would tell himself later that he had taken it well, that he had been professional, and in a technical sense that was true. He hadn't flinched, hadn't made excuses in the moment, hadn't tried to redirect, stood there and received it. But the receiving was not the hard part. The hard part was understanding why it had happened. The harder part was being honest about that understanding. After Hayes finished speaking, the range reorganized for the second phase of the evaluation. The operational components, scenarios requiring communication, target prioritization, multi-position shooting were about to begin, and the mechanics of preparations gave everyone something to do with their hands while they processed what had just happened. Salinas found himself walking toward Station 7 without entirely deciding to. Emily was running a cleaning patch through her barrel, methodical and unhurried, the way someone takes care of an instrument they intend to use for a long time. She looked up when he was close enough that ignoring him would have required effort. "Gunnery Sergeant Salinas," he said, and extended his hand. She shook it. "I watched your string," he said. "I know," she said. "That call on the thermal, waiting it out. I've never seen anyone do that in an evaluation setting." She looked at him with that steadiness she had. "Shooting the wrong conditions just produces wrong shots faster," she said. "Clock matters less than the solution." He thought about that. Most people can't make that call under observation. "Most people are thinking about the observation," she said. "I was thinking about the wind." He laughed, and it was genuine, and it surprised him a little. He said, "I can see that." There was a pause. Not uncomfortable, just present. "The first 2 hours," he said. "In the parking lot." She looked at him. That was he stopped. Reconsidered. "I don't have a word for it that doesn't sound like I'm either criticizing someone in my chain or being patronizing to you." "Then don't use a word," she said. He nodded. "Fair enough." He was about to step back when she said, without particular emphasis, "It wasn't the first time." He stopped. "It wasn't the first range," she said. "Wasn't the first evaluation." Wasn't the first time someone looked at me and made a call in 30 seconds. She went back to the cleaning patch. You learn what the silence costs, and you decide whether it's worth spending. What made you decide today, he said. She looked up. Decide what? To wait. Instead of he gestured vaguely. Escalating. She considered this like it was a genuine question that deserved a genuine answer. Because the outcome wasn't going to be different, she said. Whether I argued or waited, I was going to end up on this line eventually. The general's people knew where I was. She paused. I'd argued. The first thing anyone would have remembered about me today was the argument. And that's not what I came here for. Salinas was quiet for a moment. It's a hell of a long game to play, he said. It's the only one that works, she said simply. The second phase of the evaluation began at 15:30. It was structured differently from the morning's precision, shooting less about individual technical performance and more about adaptability, communication, and decision-making under compounded pressure. Scenarios that changed mid-execution, target lists that updated in real time. Communication requirements layered on top of the physical demands of distance shooting so that the operators had to split their cognitive load between the technical problem of the shot and the operational problem of what the shot was meant to accomplish. It was, in other words, designed to simulate actual combat conditions rather than range conditions. And like actual combat conditions, it was not kind to people who had prepared for one thing and encountered another. Emily moved through the second phase with the same quality she'd brought to the first, not flashy, not demonstrative, just relentlessly precise. When the target list updated mid-scenario and two other operators on the line broke communication protocol trying to get clarification, she held her position and worked the problem from the information she had, which turned out to be enough. When a simulated environmental hazard was introduced that required repositioning under time pressure, she repositioned faster than anyone, but not by rushing. By already knowing where she needed to be before the directive came through, because she had been reading the scenario's structure the way she read wind, looking for what it was about to do before it did it. Torres tracked her decisions in his notebook without comment. Trent tracked the evaluation scores at the command station and showed the numbers to nobody. Whitmore watched from a position that had gradually moved further back from the line over the course of the afternoon, a physical retreat that he was not consciously directing but that had happened anyway. As if his body understood something his pride was still arguing about. At 16:45, General Ruiz crossed the range toward him. He came to attention. At ease, Colonel. She stood beside him and looked at the firing line for a moment. Walk me through your assessment of today's evaluation. He gave her the professional version. Scores, conditions, mechanical issues with two operators' equipment, overall performance relative to benchmark. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, and your assessment of the Station 7 operator. Pause. Exceptional performance under adverse conditions, he said. Technical proficiency that exceeded the evaluation standard in every measurable category. She did, Ruiz agreed. She did all of that after 2 hours in a parking lot. She let a moment pass. What do you think she was thinking about out there? Whitmore opened his mouth, closed it. I don't know, he said. I think she was reading the wind, Ruiz said. I think she does that everywhere she goes. Reads the environment, figures out what it's going to do, decides how to work with it instead of against it. She looked at him steadily. That's a skill, Colonel. It doesn't stop being useful when you step off the range. He said nothing. You made a judgment call this morning, she said. It was not a question. Yes, ma'am. Tell me what it was based on. He looked at the range for a long moment, at the firing line. The woman currently in the process of completing the final evaluation string, with an efficiency that made it look from this distance almost easy. Appearance, he said, bearing the absence of visible rank or unit designation, he paused. My expectation of what the assigned operator would look like. Ruiz nodded slowly. And now, she said, he was quiet for long enough that the question could have been misread as rhetorical. Now I understand, he said, that my expectation was the problem. Ruiz looked at him for a moment longer. Something in her expression was neither warm nor cold, more the particular evenness of a person who has heard this specific realization from this specific kind of person before and has learned not to invest too much in its durability. The evaluation closes at 1700, she said. I'd recommend you be present at the final scoring. She walked back toward the observation platform. Whitmore stood where she'd left him and breathed the desert air and tried to assemble something coherent from the pieces of the day. The final string of the evaluation produced the moment that became, in the retelling, the one people always returned to. It was not the most technically impressive shot that had been in the first phase, the initial hit after the thermal weight that had stopped the firing line cold. Final string was more routine in terms of the target parameters. What made it unrepeatable was what happened around it. The last target of the day was set at 2,100 meters, beyond anything the evaluation had asked of anyone else. It had been included in the scenario structure as what the designers called a stretch objective, a target that existed at the outer edge of what was considered achievable with the platform and the conditions. Included not because anyone was expected to hit it, but because it provided data about where the ceiling actually was. Every other operator on the line looked at the 2,100-meter target and either declined to engage or fired one round as a data point before moving to the primary targets. Emily engaged it as if the distance were a minor consideration. She talked to Torres for 40 seconds, asked 2 specific questions about the wind behavior near the ridgeline at the far end of the range. Torres gave her what he had. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The wind's going to hold for about 90 seconds before it shifts. That's the window." Torres watched his instruments. "I show the same thing," he said, "give or take. So we go in 60, she said. They went in 60. The shot at 2,100 meters in that wind took longer in the air than anything fired all day. The gap between the trigger and the outcome was long enough that several people on the line who had been watching the target through optics genuinely didn't know, for a moment, whether they had seen an impact or a miss. Torres said hit. He said it the same way he'd said it every other time. Even flat, professional, like it was the expected outcome of a well-executed process. But his right hand for just a moment tapped twice against his knee. Foley, watching through his spotting scope, pulled back from the eyepiece and was quiet for a long second. Then he turned to look at Salinas. Salinas was already looking at him. Neither of them spoke. Behind the line on the scoreboard that Major Trent had been updating in silence for the last 2 hours, a final number appeared beside Station 7. It was not a number anyone had seen on that range before. General Hayes looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at the firing line. Then, for just a second, he smiled small and private, the smile of a man whose expectation has been confirmed by something he already knew was possible. Whitmore saw the number. He looked at it for a long time. He thought about the parking lot, about the 30 seconds he had spent evaluating a woman with a battered rifle case and faded tactical clothing and quiet eyes, and the conclusion he had reached in those 30 seconds, and what that conclusion had cost. Not just the range time, not just the evaluation window. What it had cost in the deeper sense, in the sense of what it said about the quality of his judgment, about the gap between the experience he believed he had and the experience that gap had just exposed. He did not share any of this with anyone standing near him. He stood straight and looked at the scoreboard and let the number exist in front of him without arguing with it. 17:2, as the range was transitioning to close out procedures and operators were securing equipment, and the SOCOM command team was gathered around the evaluation log with Hayes, something small happened that nobody would remember except the people directly involved. Emily was packing her rifle case, methodical, quiet, the same way she'd unpacked it, without performance, without commentary, just the efficient handling of something she had cared for a long time. Foley walked past her on his way to the equipment staging area and stopped. He extended his hand without preamble. "Staff Sergeant Foley," he said. "Army Rangers." She shook at Carter. "I know," he said. "I've been watching your wind reads all afternoon." "I noticed," she said, a beat. He wasn't sure what he'd expected her to say to that. Something modest, maybe. Or something pointed. There was enough material for a pointed response given the day's events. She said neither. "The thermal call," he said, 7 minutes. "How long have you been doing that? Reading thermals like that?" She thought about it. "Seriously?" "About 8 years. "Basics, longer. Who taught you?" "A chief petty officer named Estrada," she said. "He told me long-range shooting wasn't a technical problem. It was a conversation." Foley turned that over. "A conversation with what?" "Everything," she said. "The wind, the heat, the air between the rifle and the target." She looked at him. "Most shooters want to dominate the environment, force the solution." He said, "The ones who made the shots that mattered weren't the ones who forced anything. They were the ones who listened long enough to know when to speak." Foley was quiet for a moment. "That's going to stay with me," he said. "Stayed with me," she said. He nodded once and kept walking. She closed her rifle case. The latches clicked shut. And somewhere across the range, in the gathering late afternoon, Colonel Marcus Whitmore was walking toward General Hayes, with the expression of a man preparing to say something he had never in his career been required to say, moving slowly enough that anyone watching might have thought he was reluctant. They would have been right. Whitmore reached Hayes before he'd fully worked out what he was going to say. That was unusual for him. Marcus Whitmore had built 30 years of career on the ability to walk into any room, any conversation, any confrontation with his position already established and his language already chosen. He prepared, he structured, he decided how a conversation was going to go before it started, and then he steered it there. It was not manipulation, it was control, and he had always believed control was the foundation of effective leadership. He reached Hayes without a position and without language and with nothing structured. Just the facts of the day pressing against him, like something physical. "General," he said. Hayes turned from the evaluation log. The SOCOM staff around him registered Whitmore's approach and redistributed themselves slightly, creating the kind of conversational space that happens automatically in military gatherings when something significant is about to occur between senior officers. "Colonel, sir." Whitmore stopped at a distance that was professional without being evasive. "I owe you a direct statement." Hayes waited. "My decision to remove Senior Chief Carter from the range this morning was wrong," Whitmore said. "It was based on a 30-second assessment that was insufficient, and the criteria I used were not operationally relevant." He kept his voice level, not flat level. "There was a difference. I should have verified her orders at the gate and placed her at Station 7 when she arrived. I didn't do that. It won't happen again." The words were correct. Structure was correct. The delivery was professional. What Whitmore was not prepared for was Hayes's response. "I appreciate that," Hayes said. "I do." He paused. "But I want to ask you something, and I want an honest answer, not a professional one." Whitmore held himself still. "What did you see," Hayes said, "when she walked onto your range this morning?" Question was simple. The answer was not. Because the honest answer required Whitmore to put language around something he had been keeping in the nonverbal part of his thinking all day, the part where things live before you decide whether to examine them. "I saw someone who didn't match my expectation of the assigned operator," he said. "What was your expectation?" A pause, longer than the previous one. "Someone who looked like the record," Whitmore said. Hayes nodded slowly. "Describe that." Whitmore looked at him. "Sir, I'm not asking to embarrass you, Colonel. I'm asking because this conversation is important and I want to have it accurately." Whitmore took a breath. "I expected someone with visible indicators of rank and unit. Someone whose physical presentation communicated their operational background." He stopped. Then, because Hayes was waiting for the rest of it, someone who looked like what I have always understood a SEAL-qualified operator to look like. "And she didn't look like that." "No, sir, because she was a woman." The sentence sat between them in the desert air. Whitmore didn't deny it and didn't confirm it, and the space between those two responses was itself a confirmation. "I don't believe I made a conscious decision based on her gender," he said carefully. "I know you don't," Hayes said. "That's almost always how it works." He wasn't unkind about it. He delivered it with the directness of someone who had had this conversation before and had learned that indirection helped nobody. Conscious mind doesn't log the bias, it logs the conclusion. "She doesn't belong here," and then it goes looking for evidence to support the conclusion. A pause. "What evidence did you find?" "The case. The lack of visible rank, all of which could describe any operator running a low-profile assignment," Hayes said. "Yes, sir, and none of which you scrutinized on the male operators who arrived this morning." The silence was complete. "No," Whitmore said, "I didn't." Hayes looked at him for a long moment. Not with anger. Whitmore had been expecting anger, had prepared for it, had his professional receipt of criticism armor ready. What Hayes looked at him with was something closer to the long patience of a man who had watched this pattern produce damage in too many places to be surprised by it anymore, but had not yet stopped believing it could change. "The after-action review for today's evaluation will include a full leadership analysis," Hayes said. "Your decisions this morning will be part of that record, not as a disciplinary matter, as a learning document. For the program and for the community." He held Whitmore's gaze. "That means it will be read by people in this building and outside it. I want you to understand that before it happens." "I understand, sir." Pause. "Get some food, Colonel. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." Hayes turned back to the evaluation log. Whitmore walked away from the conversation carrying something heavier than he'd brought to it, which he hadn't thought was possible. The debrief was scheduled for 18:00 in the Redstone main briefing room. It was mandatory for all evaluation participants, support staff, and command observers. By 1745, the room was full, and the particular tension that collects in spaces where something significant has happened and hasn't yet been officially addressed was present and running at a low, steady frequency that everyone could feel and nobody was naming. Salinas sat next to Foley. Across the room, Torres had taken a seat near the back with two other members of Hayes' staff. Emily was not yet in the room. Foley was quiet in the way he'd been quiet since the 2,100-meter shot, the way a person gets quiet when something has recalibrated their understanding of a thing they thought they already understood well. "You know what bothers me," he said to Salinas, not quite under his breath. "I have a guess," Salinas said. "The whole time we were on that line, Every miss, every wind call that didn't work, she was out there. He kept his voice low. She could have been making those calls for us. Spotting. Reading the thermal. Any of it. And instead she was on a tailgate. Selena said nothing because there was nothing useful to add. That's not a small thing, Foley said. No, Selena said. It's not. The door opened and Emily came in. She'd changed out of her shooting clothes into fresh tactical pants and a clean shirt, still no rank. Still no unit designation, and she moved to an empty seat near the middle of the room, with the same unhurried directness she brought to everything. She sat down, looked at the briefing screen at the front of the room, and waited. People noticed her in the way a room notices a presence that has acquired specific gravity over the course of a day. Two of the support staff who had watched the evaluation from the observation platform leaned slightly toward each other and said something. Three operators who had been in conversation near the coffee station wrapped up what they were saying and took their seats. She appeared not to notice any of it. Whitmore entered at 17:58 and took his position at the front of the room. He looked like himself, composed, upright, all the external signals of a commander who had the room. The interior signals were different, but those weren't visible to most people. At 18:00 exactly, General Hayes entered. The room came to attention. "Sit down," Hayes said, and they did. Official debrief covered what debriefs always cover: scores, mechanical issues, environmental variables, procedural notes. Hayes ran it efficiently without editorializing, moving through the evaluation data with the brisk precision of someone who had run 1,000 of these and knew the difference between what needed to be said in a group and what needed to be handled individually. Then he set down his notes. "I want to spend some time on something that isn't on the evaluation scorecard," he said. "And I want everyone in this room to hear it, because what I'm about to say applies to all of you, not just to the people who were directly involved in the events of this morning." The room's quality of attention shifted. The difference between people listening to a debrief and people listening to something they understand will matter. At approximately 8:30 this morning, a qualified operator with valid orders from this command was removed from this range before participating in the evaluation. He paused. The decision was made quickly, based on visual assessment, and without verification of the operator's credentials. Another pause. "I am not here to assign individual blame for that decision in this forum. What I am here to do is to make sure everyone in this room understands what that decision represents and what it costs." He looked around the room, not searching, just including, making sure the words had a destination in every person present. Every one of us makes rapid assessments. We do it because in our operational environment, speed of judgment is a survival skill. We assess threat levels, we assess terrain, we assess the people around us, and we make calls in seconds that have to be good enough to act on. He stopped. Problem is that the same mental process that keeps you alive in the field can also produce decisions in non-combat environments that are driven by the wrong inputs. When you're not reading a threat, when you're reading a person, the data you weight changes. And the data you weight in those moments is often data you didn't consciously choose to weight. Foley was watching the general with the focused stillness of a man hearing something he needed to hear and knew it. Appearance, gender, age, the way someone carries themselves relative to what you expected to see. Hayes's voice was even. Not lecturing, informing. None of those things are reliable indicators of operational capability. Every person in this room knows that intellectually. But knowing something intellectually and applying it in a 30-second judgment call are two different cognitive events. He paused long enough for that to settle. What happened today is that a range lost 2 hours of contribution from the most technically accomplished distance shooter in this evaluation. Because of a 30-second call, he let the math exist without commentary. Multiply that across a career, multiply it across a community. Multiply it across every environment where that kind of call gets made about someone who doesn't match the template. He stopped. That is not a small cost. The room was absolutely still. Emily sat in the middle of it and looked at her hands for a moment. Just a moment. Then she looked back at the screen. After Hayes finished the formal portion of the debrief, the room broke into smaller conversations that had the particular quality of people who have been given something large to think about and are in the first stages of thinking about it. Whitmore moved toward the exit and almost made it. "Colonel," he turned. Emily was standing 3 feet away. She had crossed the room quietly, the way she did everything, and he had not heard her coming. He looked at her. "Senior Chief," he said. She held his gaze with that steadiness. Up close, in the diminished light of the briefing room, it was even more apparent than it had been on the range. There was no hostility in her eyes, no satisfaction, no carefully maintained neutrality that was hostility by another name. She was looking at him the way she looked at everything, directly, without excess. I want to say something, she said, and I'd like you to hear it as it's meant, not as it might sound. He nodded. I've been where you put me this morning more times than I can count, she said. Different ranges, different commands, different evaluations. The circumstances change. The shape of the thing doesn't. She wasn't accusatory. She was precise, the same quality she brought to a 2,000-meter wind call. Most of the time, the person who makes the call doesn't know they've made it. They genuinely believe they're responding to something legitimate. Credential issue, a protocol concern, a gut feeling about preparedness. She paused. I know you believe that this morning. Whitmore stood with that. I did, he said. That doesn't make it right. No, she said. It doesn't. A pause, but it makes it something that can change. There's a difference between a decision that comes from malice and a decision that comes from a blind spot. Malice doesn't respond to information. Blind spots do. She looked at him steadily. You received a lot of information today. He didn't look away. I did. Then it wasn't a wasted day, she said. She held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she nodded. Not the small, tight acknowledgement she'd given him this morning, but something slightly warmer. Not forgiveness, exactly. More the particular respect that passes between two people who have been honest with each other. She walked past him toward the door. He stood there for a moment. Major Trent appeared at his shoulder. Because Trent always appeared at his shoulder and said nothing, because sometimes Trent's greatest skill was knowing when nothing was the right thing to say. The evening that followed had the quality of a day that refuses to finish processing. Operators who had been at the range gathered in the Redstone Common area, with the loose informality of people who have shared something that hasn't been fully converted into language yet. The conversation moved in the way conversation moves after a significant shared experience, circling the thing, approaching it from angles, finding the edges of it without going directly to the center. Foley ended up sitting across from Torres, Emily's spotter, who turned out to be quieter than he looked and more willing to talk than his quietness suggested. How long have you worked with her? Foley asked. 3 years, Torres said. On and off. She always shoot like that? Torres considered the question seriously, the way it deserved. She shoots like that when the situation requires it, he said. When it doesn't, she shoots like somebody who's trying not to attract attention. Foley looked at him. She can dial it down? She doesn't think of it as dialing, Torres said. She thinks of it as calibration. She gives the situation what the situation needs. Not more. He took a drink of coffee. Most people, and I include myself in this, most people give situations what they're capable of. Their maximum, their best. Because we're wired to prove something. He set the cup down. She's not wired like that. What's she wired like? Foley said. Torres thought about it. Like somebody who already knows what she's capable of, and doesn't need anyone else to confirm it. Foley was quiet for a moment. That's a rare thing, he said. Yeah, Torres said. It is. Across the room, Salinas was having a different conversation. One of the younger operators, a ranger named Castillo, 26 years old, on his first formal SOCOM evaluation had approached him with the slightly tentative energy of someone who has a question they're not sure is appropriate. Gunny, Castillo said. Can I ask you something? Go ahead, today. What happened this morning? With the Colonel and Senior Chief Carter, he paused. Does that happen a lot? In this community? Salinas looked at him for a moment. Why are you asking me? He said, not deflecting, genuinely curious about the angle. Castillo thought about it. Because you're the most senior operator I know who was on that line. And because you didn't say anything when it happened. The sentence landed with quiet accuracy. Salinas received it without flinching. No, he said, I didn't. Why not? Salinas sat with the question for a moment that stretched longer than Castillo expected. Because I told myself it was being handled, Salinas said. Because the Colonel outranked me and the situation seemed like it was being managed, and I made the same calculations most people make that inserting myself would create more friction than resolution. He looked at Castillo directly. And because, if I'm being completely honest, I wasn't certain enough in that first moment about what I was seeing to stake something on it. Castillo was quiet. That's the part that bothers me now, Salinas said. Not that I didn't charge in, but that I wasn't certain, because I should have been. He paused. When you see something wrong and your uncertainty is convenient when being unsure happens to line up with the easier path that's worth examining. Dio nodded slowly. Does it get easier? He said. Knowing when to say something? No, Salinas said. You get better at recognizing when the uncertainty is real and when it's just fear wearing uncertainty's clothes. Emily was on the phone when General Ruiz found her. She finished the call quickly, 2 sentences, a confirmation, a time, and pocketed the phone. General, she said. At ease, Ruiz stood beside her. They were near the edge of the common area, close enough to the wider gathering to be visible, but far enough from it to be private. I watched your evaluation today, Ruiz said. All of it. Yes, ma'am. The waiting, the thermal call, the 2,100-meter engagement. She paused. I've been in this community for 22 years. I've watched a lot of shooters on a lot of ranges. Emily said nothing. She understood this wasn't the part where she was supposed to speak. You understand why General Hayes chose this evaluation for you, Ruiz said. It wasn't entirely a question. I have some understanding, Emily said carefully. Tell me what you understand. Emily considered this. The evaluation was a selection event, not for the shooters, for the program, and specifically for the question of who would lead the next phase of it. She paused. My assignment to this range wasn't incidental, it was a variable. Ruiz looked at her steadily. A variable, a test of how the command structure responded to something outside their template, Emily said. The shooting was real. My orders were real. But the way I was inserted into the evaluation, no visible rank, the low-profile arrival, the timing of General Hayes's appearance, that architecture wasn't accidental. Ruiz was quiet for a moment. And how does that sit with you, she said. Being a variable. Emily thought about it, honest, because the question deserved honesty. I've been a variable my entire career, she said. Usually without being told, she paused. At least this time I knew in advance. Something moved in Ruiz's expression, not quite a smile. Something adjacent to respect. The mission Hayes is putting together, Ruiz said. The one this evaluation was building toward. Do you know the details? I know the outline, Emily said, not the specifics. Specifics are classified at a level that requires us a separate briefing. Ruiz looked at her. What I can tell you in this context is that the team selection process, the actual selection, not today's evaluation, begins in 48 hours. And the criteria for team composition are unconventional. Emily looked at her. How unconventional? The mission requires operators who can move without being identified as operators, Ruiz said. Who can be underestimated as a deliberate tactical asset? She paused to let that settle. Team lead needs to be someone who has experience operating in environments where the people around them have consistently failed to recognize what they were dealing with. The silence between them was very specific. You're describing my entire career, Emily said. Yes, Ruiz said, I am. Emily was quiet for a moment. The weight of what was being communicated was real, and she gave it the weight it deserved, rather than responding immediately. Who else knows about the team lead criteria, she said. Hayes, the mission planners. Ruiz paused. Whitmore doesn't, in case you were wondering. Emily nodded slowly. 48-hour timeline, she said. That starts now? Started this morning, Ruiz said. When you walked onto Whitmore's range. Whitmore found the evaluation report on his desk at 20:00. It had been prepared by Trent with the thoroughness that characterized everything. Trent produced organized, accurate, inclusive of all the relevant data without editorializing about what the data meant. Scores, the environmental conditions, the equipment issues, timeline of the day's events. And on page 4, under the section marked Leadership Observations, a paragraph that Whitmore read 3 times. It documented, in precise and neutral language, the events of 830 to 1047, the arrival of the assigned operator at Station 7, the intervention at the range entrance, the duration of the waiting period, clearance verification process, the arrival of General Hayes, the resumption of the operator's participation. It was accurate. It was complete. It was written without judgment, which made it, in some ways, harder to read than a document that had been written with judgment, because a judgmental document gave you something to argue with. This one just told the truth and stopped. He set it down. He thought about what Emily had said to him after the debrief, the distinction she had drawn between malice and blind spots, between things that don't change and things that do. He thought about 30 years, about the ranges he had commanded and the evaluations he had overseen and the operators he had assessed and the calls he had made in 30 seconds about who looked like they belonged and who didn't. He thought about how many of those calls he had never examined because they had never been examined for him, because the outcome hadn't forced the examination. Today the outcome had forced it. He thought about whether that made him lucky or simply overdue. He picked up a pen and opened his own notebook, not the official one, the personal one he'd kept since his first command, and he wrote a single sentence. He didn't share it with anyone and didn't intend to. It was the kind of thing that needed to exist in writing before it could exist reliably in action. He wrote, "What you see in the first 30 seconds is not the truth. It is your expectation of the truth. These are not the same thing." He looked at it for a moment. Then he closed the notebook and reached for the evaluations report and began writing his commanding officer's addendum, which was going to be the most honest document he had produced in 30 years of producing military documents, and which was going to be uncomfortable to write, and which he was going to write anyway. Torres found Emily in the equipment bay at 21:00, running her final maintenance check before the case went back into secured storage. He leaned against the doorframe and watched her work for a moment before she acknowledged him. "You knew," he said. She didn't look up. "About the variable setup? Hayes briefed me 3 weeks ago," she said. "Not the specifics, the shape of it. And you came anyway." "Of course I came anyway." Torres was quiet for a moment. 2 hours on a tailgate is a long time to be a variable. She looked up at him then. "It's a longer time to be the only one who doesn't know you're being watched." He considered that. Whitmore. "The whole command structure," she said. The evaluation was real. The operators were being evaluated on their shooting, their adaptability, their communication. Command was being evaluated on how it handled something unexpected. She went back to the maintenance check. Today was always going to be today. The question was just what everyone was going to do with it. And Whitmore? She was quiet for a moment. "He told me the truth when I gave him the chance," she said. "It matters." Torres looked at her. "Most people in your position wouldn't weight that very heavily." "Most people in my position spend a lot of energy being angry," she said. "I decided a long time ago that anger was expensive and results were cheaper." She set down the cleaning cloth. "He made a wrong call. He owned it. The community gets a learning document. Program gets a different framework for evaluator selection." She looked at Torres. "That's not nothing. And you," Torres said, "what do you get out of today?" She looked at him for a moment, with something that might, in better light, have been amusement. "I get to find out what the mission is," she said. Torres straightened up from the doorframe. "Ruiz talked to you." For about 10 minutes, and Emily closed the rifle case. The latches clicked into place with the same clean, decisive sound they had made when she opened it that morning at Station 7, a sound that had stopped a firing line cold. It had been the first signal to everyone watching that something was different about this moment. And she said, "I think it's going to be a very interesting 48 hours. She lifted the case and walked past Torres toward the storage locker, and Torres watched her go and thought about what Foley had said that afternoon, that she didn't look like what you expected, and understood that this quality, this fundamental mismatch between appearance and reality, was not an inconvenience she had learned to endure. It was a weapon she had learned to carry. And somewhere in the Redstone facility, in a secured communications room, a mission brief was being finalized that would require exactly that weapon, would require someone who moved through the world without being seen as dangerous, who could walk into a room full of people who had already decided she didn't matter, and leave having accomplished something they would never see coming. The latches on her rifle case clicked one more time as she secured it in storage. 48-hour clock kept running. The briefing room at 600 the next morning held 7 people and 1 set of sealed documents that nobody had opened yet. Hayes sat at the head of the table, Ruiz to his left, far end, with a legal pad and 2 pens. Emily sat midway down the right side, her hands flat on the table, her posture the kind of relaxed that only comes from having been in rooms like this enough times to know that tension before a briefing is wasted energy. The other 3 people in the room were new. The first was a man named Garrett, no first name offered, no rank displayed, the particular anonymity of someone who operated in spaces where names were liabilities. He was compact and still and had the eyes of a person who processed information faster than most people generated it. He'd been placed at the table by Hayes' staff without introduction, and nobody had asked for one. The second was Lieutenant Commander David Ossie, Navy, whose file Emily knew by reputation, a cryptologist who had crossed over into field operations and had the unusual distinction of being genuinely exceptional at both. He was tall, precise, and looked slightly uncomfortable in the room the way brilliant technical people sometimes look uncomfortable in rooms that are about to ask them to do things that can't be reduced to data. Third was the one who made Emily sit slightly straighter when he walked in. Chief Warrant Officer Raymond Estrada, her first sniper instructor. The man who had told her long-range shooting was a conversation, not a calculation. 15 years older than when she'd last seen him in a professional context, moving with the careful economy of someone whose body had been through enough that it now required negotiation rather than command. He sat across from her without expression and looked at her for exactly 1 second before looking at the sealed documents in the center of the table. He didn't greet her. She didn't greet him, in a different room that would have seemed cold. In this room it was its own kind of language. Hayes broke the seal on the documents. "What I'm about to tell you does not leave this room through any channel other than need-to-know operational communication," he said. "You've all been cleared for the material. What you do with your reaction to the material is your own business, but I'd recommend keeping it internal." He opened the top folder. The mission is called Operation Glasswall. It has been in planning for 14 months. It has been delayed twice, once for intelligence gaps and once for personnel reasons. He looked around the table. Personnel reason was finding the right team lead. That search is now complete. Everyone in the room knew who he meant. Nobody looked at Emily directly. Garrett looked at the table. Osi looked at Hayes. Estrada looked at the middle distance with the careful attention of someone receiving information he had partially anticipated. Emily looked at Hayes and waited. Glasswell targets a network, Hayes continued. Not a person, not a location, a network. Operates across 3 countries, uses commercial infrastructure as cover, and has been responsible for the compromise of at least 4 intelligence assets in the past 18 months. He set down the first page. 2 of those assets are dead, 1 is missing, 1 is in a situation we are not discussing in detail in this room. Temperature in the room changed. Not physically, the air was the same. The quality of attention shifted the way it shifts when something moves from abstract to real. The network's leadership has a specific profile, Hayes said. They do not respond to conventional military pressure because they don't operate in conventional military spaces. They move in commercial environments, business travel, private conferences, academic institutions. They entirely unremarkable, he paused. Which means the people who go after them need to be equally unremarkable. Garrett shifted in his seat. Barely perceptible, Emily caught it. Team lead needs to be someone who can walk into the network's operational environment and be assessed immediately and confidently as non-threatening, Hayes said. Who will be underestimated at every level of contact. Who has the operational depth to exploit that underestimation precisely and completely. He closed the folder. Senior Chief Carter has been selected as team lead for Glasswall. This selection is final. Questions about the selection go to me directly and will be addressed individually. Nobody asked a question about the selection. What happened instead was a silence that lasted about 4 seconds and contained within it several different kinds of acceptance. Garrett's was professional and immediate, the silence of a man who evaluates new information and moves on. Osi's was more complex, the silence of someone recalibrating an expectation and finding the recalibration reasonable. Estrada's was the shortest, because Estrada had already known since before he walked into this room, and his silence was simply the acknowledgement of a thing confirmed. Emily said, "What's the timeline?" 72 hours to full team briefing, Hayes said. The mission window opens in 18 days. 18 days, she repeated. That's the constraint. It's not negotiable. The network's principals will be in the same location for a 4-day window that closes on day 18. After that, the next opportunity is projected at 16 to 24 months. Emily looked at the sealed folders in the center of the table. I need the full intelligence package within the next 6 hours. Will be in your hands in 4, Hayes said. I also need a conversation with Garrett, she said. Today, before the full team briefing, Garrett looked up at her for the first time since she'd entered the room. His expression was exactly what she expected, evaluative, contained, giving away nothing while taking in everything. That can be arranged, Hayes said. One more thing, Emily said. She looked at Hayes steadily. Estrada is on this team in what capacity? Operational advisor, Hayes said. His field experience with the network's regional structure is the deepest we have. Emily looked at Estrada. He looked back at her. You knew about this before today, she said. Not accusing, confirming. 3 weeks, he said. His voice was the same as she remembered, unhurried, carrying more weight per word than most people managed per sentence. Hayes briefed me when they confirmed the timeline. And you didn't contact me? No, he said. Why not? He held her gaze. Because what happened at Redstone yesterday needed to happen without interference, he said. And if you'd known I was connected to the mission, it would have changed how you read the situation. Emily was quiet for a moment. You were watching, she said. I was watching, said. The parking lot. The whole thing, he said. From the observation platform, Ruiz knew I was there. Hayes knew. Nobody else did. The information settled into the room. Garrett looked at the table with the expression of someone who was updating several calculations simultaneously. Osi blinked once and then composed his face. Emily looked at Estrada for a long moment. How'd I do? She said. It was the first time anyone in the room had heard something approaching lightness in her voice. It was brief, barely there, but it was real. Estrada's expression moved. Just slightly. The closest he got to a smile was a particular settling of the muscles around his eyes. Waited out the thermal, he said. Yeah, she said. That's how you did, he said. The intelligence package arrived in 3 hours and 40 minutes, which was 20 minutes ahead of Hayes's promise, and told Emily something about how seriously the mission planners were treating the timeline. She read it in a secured room with Torres and Ose, working through the material in the methodical sequence she had developed for processing complex intelligence geography first, person, then financial architecture, then operational pattern analysis. Each layer informed the next. Each piece of the network structure became more legible once you understood the layer beneath it. By the second hour, OC had filled 4 pages of his legal pad with notations, and was deep in what Emily had come to recognize as his operational thinking mode, a stillness that was different from ordinary stillness, more focused, generating something internally that would eventually need to come out as a plan. Torres said nothing for the first 90 minutes. Then he said, "The network's primary contact node for the conference is a man named Voss." "Henrik Voss," Emily said, without looking up from her document. "Commercial real estate. Uses property management as the organizational infrastructure. Money moves through lease agreements and service contracts. You already found him. He's the third most important person in this package, and they put him in Section 7, she said. It's a structural tell. Whoever wrote this brief was trying not to make him obvious." Torres looked at her. Why would the analyst bury him? "They didn't bury him intentionally," she said. "They buried him because their framework for organizing the material was based on hierarchy. They led with the principles and worked down. But Voss isn't operating in the hierarchy, he's operating adjacent to it. He's the connective tissue." She set down the page. "Principles are visible because they have to be visible to maintain credibility in their cover environments. Voss is invisible because his job is to make the money move without leaving fingerprints. That makes him more operationally critical than either of the principles." OC looked up from his legal pad. "If Voss is the connective tissue, taking the principles doesn't collapse the network," Emily said. "You have to take Voss," OC said. "You have to take Voss first," Emily said. "And you have to do it without signaling to the principles that the network has been touched. Otherwise they disappear before the 4-day window closes." The room was quiet for a moment. "That's a sequencing problem," Torres said. 3 sequencing problems layered on top of each other," Emily said. "And we have 18 days to solve all of them." She looked at both of them. "Which is why I need to talk to Garrett." Garrett was waiting in a different secured room when Emily arrived at 14:00. He had a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking and a tablet he'd turned face down on the table, and he stood when she entered without making a production of it. She sat down across from him. "You were read into this mission 14 months ago," she said. 12, he said. "I came in 2 months after initial planning." "What's your read on Voss?" He looked at her carefully. "You've been in the package for what, 3 hours? 3.5, and you're already on Voss. Is that a problem?" "No," he said slowly. "It's just the planning team has been on this for over a year, and Voss didn't become the operational priority until about 6 weeks ago." "What changed 6 weeks ago?" she said. Garrett was quiet for a moment. Kind of quiet that precedes a decision about how much to share. "One of our assets inside the network sent a communication," he said. "Before they went dark, the missing asset," Emily said. "Yes. What did the communication say?" Garrett looked at the face-down tablet, then back at her. "It said Voss was planning to exit the network after the conference," he said. "Take his operational infrastructure with him and either go independent or sell the methodology to a different buyer." He paused. "That happens before we can get to him. The leverage we have on the network's financial architecture disappears. We'd be back to targeting principals who are very good at surviving principal-level attention." Emily absorbed this. "The conference isn't just a window for us," she said. Garrett said. "It's a window for Voss, yes. He's planning to use it as a handoff event." Garrett nodded slowly. "That's the assessment." Emily looked at the table for a moment. Working through the architecture of the problem, the sequencing, the dependencies, the points of leverage. The way she looked at a thermal column or a wind pattern, listening for what it was about to do. "Principals will be at the conference," she said. "Voss will be at the conference. Whatever handoff Voss is planning will happen during the conference." She looked at Garrett. "Which means our window and his window are the same window," Garrett said. "Which is what makes this," she said. He looked at her. It's interesting," she said again. And she meant it, in the way she'd meant it on the tailgate the previous morning, waiting out a colonel's 30-second judgment, curious about what would happen next. 4 days, 3 simultaneous objectives. A network that doesn't know we're coming and a node that's planning to leave before we get there. She paused. "What assets do we have inside the conference environment?" "None currently placed," Garrett said. "The plan was to insert during registration." "Which happens when?" "Day 1 of the 4-day window. So we have 1 day to establish presence before Voss starts his process." "Correct." Emily nodded slowly. "I need to see the conference participant list. Full list, not just the flagged individuals. I can get that. And the venue layout, not the physical description, the operational layout. Entry points, communication infrastructure. The patterns of movement that the event organizers would have built into the schedule. Takes a day to compile." "Then start now," she said. Garrett looked at her for a moment. He'd worked with a lot of team leads over a career that had taken him through environments most people didn't have clearances to know existed. He had a personal taxonomy for them, a private framework for categorizing the kind of leader a person was likely to be based on the first real conversation about a complex operational problem. Emily Carter, Cass, in the first real conversation about a complex operational problem, had identified the critical node in the network before the planning team had in 12 months, understood the sequencing challenge before it was explained to her, and was now driving the operational setup conversation with the clarity and speed of someone who had already synthesized what would take most people another day to process. He updated his taxonomy. "I'll have the conference materials to you by 800 tomorrow," he said. "Good," she said. She stood up. "One more thing." He waited. "Yesterday morning," she said. "At the range. Were you there?" Pause. "No, but you heard about it." "By 1100, he said. She looked at him steadily. "And your read on Whitmore?" Garrett considered this carefully. "He made a bad call based on incomplete criteria and then stood in front of it when it cost him," he said. "Which is better than most." "That's my read too," she said. She walked to the door and stopped. "When Hayes briefs the full team tomorrow," she said, "Whitmore won't be in that room." "No," Garrett said. "But the after-action documentation will reach his chain," she said. "It already has," Garrett said. She nodded once. "Good," she said, and left. Salinas heard about the mission from nobody, because that was how classified operations worked. What he heard about, through the particular information network that exists in any gathering of special operations professionals, quiet, fast, surprisingly accurate, was that the evaluation at Redstone had produced a team selection. The team lead was the shooter from Station 7. And that whatever was being put together was operating on a compressed timeline that suggested something real was in motion. He heard this from Foley, who had heard it from Torres, who had said nothing specific and everything through implication. "She's leading it," Foley said. "Of course she is," Selena said. "You're not surprised, are you?" Foley thought about it. "No," he said, "I'm not." He paused. "I'm something else." "What?" Foley looked at the middle distance for a moment. "Glad she waited us out," he said, "on the tailgate." Instead of what? "Instead of whatever else she could have done," Foley said. "If she'd pushed back on Whitmore, made the call to Hayes directly, escalated." He paused. "She would have been right to." "She had every justification," yeah, Selena said. "But then today would have been a different kind of day," Foley said. "The mission would still exist. But the room would be different. Team would be different." He stopped. "People would have spent the day watching a confrontation instead of watching a 1,100-meter shot." Salinas considered this. "She controlled the narrative," he said. "She didn't fight for control," Foley said. "She just didn't give up the ground that mattered." He shook his head slowly. "That's a different skill." Salinas nodded. He thought about the cleaning cloth he'd been holding when she opened her case at Station 7. How he'd set it down and hadn't picked it back up. "Thing Estrada said," Salinas said, "in the debrief." "He barely said anything in the debrief," Foley said. "Exactly," Salinas said. "He sat there the whole time and said almost nothing and watched everything. And the one thing he said was," he paused, reconstructing it. "He said the best operators he'd ever worked with weren't the ones who were hardest to stop. They were the ones who were hardest to see." Foley was quiet. "He was talking about her," Salinas said. "He was talking about the whole thing," Foley said. "Whitmore couldn't see her. The range couldn't see her. Nobody except Hayes and whoever else knew they couldn't see what was standing in front of them." He paused. "And she used that. She's been using it her whole career," Salinas said. "They sat with that. Outside somewhere in the Redstone facility, the preparation for Glasswall was accelerating. Documents were being compiled, and movement was being coordinated. The team was being assembled around a woman who had spent the previous morning on a tailgate in the desert, waiting, out, reading the environment, listening, before speaking. Doing what Estrada had taught her, what 15 years of operating in spaces where she was chronically underestimated had refined into something that no longer required effort the patient, precise use of other people's blindness as operational terrain. Whitmore's addendum to the evaluation report was submitted at 23:0. It was 4 pages. He had written and deleted, and rewritten it 3 times before arriving at a version that was honest, without being performative, that acknowledged what needed to be acknowledged without converting the acknowledgement into a display. First page covered the operational decisions and their consequences in the language of military documentation: clear, sequential, accountable. The second page covered something different. It was titled, simply, Assessment Criteria Review, and it laid out, in precise and uncomfortable language, the criteria that had informed his 30-second judgment at the range entrance. Not in defense of those criteria, in examination of them. Where they had come from, what experiences and environments and unchallenged assumptions had built them, what they were designed to identify, and what they systematically failed to identify. It was the most honest document he had written in 30 years. Third page was a recommendation, not for himself, for the evaluation program. Proposal for adding a structured review of evaluator assessment criteria to the program's preparation process, so that the people making judgments about other people's operational readiness were themselves required to examine the foundations of those judgments before they walked onto a range with authority in certain 30 seconds. Fourth page was short. It said, "I have served in this community for 30 years. I have believed throughout that time that I was a good judge of operational capability. Today I learned that I have been, in ways I did not examine, judging the appearance of capability rather than its substance. I am grateful that the outcome of this error was a day's delay and a learning document, rather than something that cannot be corrected. I intend to carry this examination forward." He signed it and submitted it and sat in the quiet of his office for a long time. He thought about Emily Carter sitting on a tailgate in the Arizona heat, patient as a thermal column, waiting for conditions to cooperate. He thought about what it cost to do that, not the physical cost, the interior one. The requirement of being secure enough in your own knowledge of your own capability that someone else's failure to recognize it had no power to destabilize you. That you could receive someone's blindness and simply wait for the light to change. Because you knew with the bone-deep certainty of a shooter who has made a 2,100-meter hit in wind that shouldn't have permitted it, you knew exactly what you were capable of and didn't need their confirmation to keep being it. He had not possessed that quality today. He had been, by contrast, completely dependent on other people's recognition of his authority, his rank, his 30 years of service. So dependent on it that when he encountered someone who was not performing that recognition, his immediate instinct had been to enforce it, make the thing visible that wasn't being acknowledged. She had not needed that. She had needed nothing from him except to be allowed to do her job, and he had spent 2 hours failing to provide even that. He opened his notebook to the sentence he had written the night before. "What you see in the first 30 seconds is not the truth. It is your expectation of the truth." He read it. Then he wrote underneath it, "The gap between these two things is where you find out who you actually are." At 600 the following morning, Emily was back in the secured briefing room with the full team assembled for the first time. Garrett, Osi, Torres, Estrada, 2 additional operators whose names and backgrounds she had spent the previous evening reading and whose capabilities she had already begun mapping against the operational requirements. And 1 addition that nobody had mentioned to her. Castillo, the young ranger who had asked Salinas the question about speaking up, who had been at the range during the evaluation, who had been selected, she would later learn through Ruiz specifically, because Hayes wanted someone on this team who had witnessed the events at Redstone firsthand and understood at a foundational level what the mission's approach to being underestimated actually looked like in practice. He was 26 years old and looked slightly overwhelmed in a way he was working very hard to conceal. She looked at him for a moment when he walked in. He looked back at her with the direct, uncertain steadiness of someone who is trying to be equal to a room they're not sure they belong in. She recognized the feeling from years of experience. "Ranger Castillo," she said. "Senior Chief," he said. "You asked Salinas a question yesterday," she said, "about whether what happened at the range happens a lot." He stilled slightly. "Yes, ma'am. What did you do with his answer?" Pause. He was deciding whether to give her the managed response or the real one. She watched him make the decision. "I wrote it down," he said. His answer. "And then I wrote down the question I should have asked instead of the one I asked." She looked at him. "What was the question you should have asked?" "Not whether it happens a lot," he said, "but what you do about it when it happens in front of you and you're not the most senior person in the room." The briefing room was quiet. Emily looked at him for another moment. "That," she said, "is exactly the kind of question this team needs people asking." She turned to the rest of the room. "Sit down. We have 18 days and 3 sequencing problems and a network that has no idea we exist." She looked around the table. "Let's make sure it stays that way for exactly as long as we need it to." She opened the mission folder, and Glasswall began. The 18 days passed the way operational preparations always pass, too fast and too slow simultaneously, each hour carrying both the weight of insufficient time and the grinding pressure of too much to process. Emily ran the team hard, not brutally precisely. There was a difference, and she understood it, the way she understood when you push too hard in the wrong direction and you lose everything. Find the right channel and the force multiplies itself. She knew what each person on the team could carry, and she loaded them to that level, not beyond it, because a team that arrived at the mission window exhausted was a team that made mistakes. And in Glasswall there was no margin for mistakes of any kind. OC built the financial architecture map in 6 days. Buff What had taken the original planning team 4 months, he reconstructed and refined in 6 days because he was working from Emily's identification of Voss as the connective tissue, and that framework gave him the right lens for the data. The money moved through lease agreements and service contracts the way she had identified, but OC found something the original analysts had missed. The secondary layer. Shell entities nested inside the property management infrastructure that served as a buffering mechanism between Voss and the principals. Clean the surface layer and the network looked intact. You had to go 3 levels deep before the real connections became visible. He brought this to Emily at day 7. She looked at his map for 4 minutes without speaking. "Handoff Voss is planning," she said. "It's not just methodology. He's selling access to the buffer layer." "That's what it looks like," OC said. "Which means whoever he's selling to already knows the network exists and is buying the ability to use it invisibly." She looked at him. "This isn't an exit, it's an expansion." OC nodded slowly. "The network doesn't collapse when Voss leaves. It replicates." Emily set down the map. "Get this to Garrett tonight," she said. "And copy Hayes directly. This changes the mission priority sequencing." "How Voss isn't the secondary objective anymore," she said. "He's the primary. We take him before the conference begins, not during it." OC looked at her. "That's outside the original operational window." "I know," she said, "which is why I need Hayes to authorize the adjustment before day 10. She picked up her phone. Hayes answered on the second ring. The authorization came back in 11 hours, which was fast enough that Emily understood Hayes had been expecting the request or something like it, and had already been thinking through the implications. The mission parameters adjusted, the timeline compressed. What had been a 4-day operational window inside the conference became a 5-day window that began 1 day before registration opened and required the team to be in position 24 hours earlier than originally planned. Castillo absorbed the change at the morning briefing without visible reaction, which Emily noted. A week earlier, he had been the newest and least certain person in the room. 7 days of working alongside Garrett O.C. Torres, Estrada had done something to him, not made him different exactly, but made the capable version of himself more available. Less filtered through self-consciousness, more directly present. Estrada had noticed it too. "He's going to be good," Estrada told Emily on day 9. In the quiet way, Estrada delivered assessments not as predictions but as observations of something already in motion. "He's already good," Emily said. "He just doesn't know the difference yet between being good and trusting that he's good." Estrada looked at her. "You remember being there?" "Every day at Redstone was being there," she said. Pause. "Not the tailgate," she said. "A moment before the tailgate, when Whitmore pointed at me and I had to decide how to respond." She looked at Estrada. "Tailgate was easy. I'd already made the decision before I walked back to the truck." "What was the decision?" "That the outcome I wanted was more important than the satisfaction of the moment I could have had," she said. "And math wasn't hard. It just required being clear about what I actually wanted." Estrada was quiet for a moment. "Raymond Estrada," she said, using his full name the way she'd used it when she was 19 and in his class, and learning what it meant to listen to an environment before making demands of it. "Why are you really on this team?" He looked at her. "Hayes said operational advisor," she said. "Regional infrastructure knowledge." "Both true," she held his gaze. "But you've been in field retirement for 2 years. You don't run active missions anymore. Your knees won't let you, and you made peace with that." She paused. "So why are you here?" Estrada was quiet long enough that she thought he might redirect. Then he said, "Because I told Hayes 18 months ago that the right team lead for a mission like this was someone who had spent a career being underestimated and had learned to use it operationally instead of fighting it." He paused. "He asked me if I knew someone like that." Emily looked at him. "I gave him your name," Estrada said. "And then I told him I wanted to be in the room when it happened." The silence between them had the quality of something that had been true for a long time and was only now being said. "You built the mission around the team lead profile," she said. "Not the other way around." "Hayes built it," Estrada said. "I just told him what to look for." She absorbed this. "A variable setup," she said. "Redstone Whitmore." "All of it was always going to be the selection event," Estrada said. "The range conditions, the command structure, the absence of visible rank Hayes, designed the insertion specifically to surface how the existing program responded to someone who didn't fit the template. The shooting was real, the evaluation was real." He paused. "But the real question on the table that day was never about marksmanship." Emily looked at him for a long moment. "You could have told me," she said. "No," he said. "I couldn't. Because if you'd known you were being watched for that specific quality, the ability to absorb institutional blindness without losing your operational footing, you would have performed it instead of lived it." He held her gaze. "And the difference between those two things is everything. Especially in a mission where the only asset you have is being exactly what you appear to be." she said finally. Was perfect, he said. She looked at him for one more moment. Then she turned back to the mission materials. Don't let me find out you have any more surprises in this operation, she said. I have one more, he said, but you'll find out on day 1. Day 1 arrived at 400 with a briefing, at 600 with wheels up, and at 1,400 local time with the team moving through the conference venue in pairs, establishing presence before registration opened, mapping movement patterns and communication infrastructure with the practiced invisibility of people who had spent careers being overlooked. Emily moved through the venue as herself. That was the operational genius of the insertion. She required no cover identity, no constructed persona, no performance. She was a quiet woman in unremarkable professional clothing carrying a bag that held nothing suspicious. Every person who encountered her completed a rapid unconscious assessment and filed her as non-threatening. She was not striking, she was not loud, she was not performing confidence in a way that registered as confidence. She simply existed in the environment with the calm, grounded presence of someone who belonged there, and belonging was the most effective cover identity in existence. Garrett moved differently. He had the particular quality of a man who could adjust his observable personality the way Emily adjusted for wind, reading the environment, finding the right calibration, producing whatever surface presentation the situation required. In the lobby, he was a business traveler checking messages. In the conference registration area, he was organized, efficient, slightly impatient, in the way of someone whose time was worth something. Nobody looked at him twice, nobody looked at him once, really. He moved through spaces and left no impression, which was the hardest thing to do and the most valuable. Torres and Osi were working the communication layer technical surveillance that would take 12 hours to fully establish and required a precision of placement that had kept Osi awake for 2 nights rehearsing the sequence. Castillo was positioned outside, moving through the venue's perimeter with the particular attention of someone who had been told to treat everything he saw as data. He was good at this, better than Emily had expected, though she had expected good. He moved with the unassuming quality of youth, which in this environment was its own kind of cover. Nobody worries about the 26-year-old who looks like he might be an intern. Strada was the one surprise she'd been promised. He arrived at the venue not as an operational team member but as a registered conference participant, a retired military officer with a legitimate consulting background, credentialed in regional security infrastructure, all of it real, all of it verifiable, none of it classified. He moved through the registration process with the ease of someone who had done this kind of thing in enough real contexts that doing it now required no performance at all. He found Voss within 40 minutes of entering the conference space. Emily received the confirmation through the team channel at 14:52. 3 words: have visual confirmed. She sent back 2, hold position. Henrik Voss was not what the intelligence file had prepared her for. She had built a mental image from the documents, the profile of a man whose entire operational value was invisibility, whose decades of moving money through commercial infrastructure had been built on being the least interesting person in any room. She had expected someone deliberately gray, someone who had cultivated unremarkability the way a method actor cultivates a character. What she saw when Estrada's visual guidance brought her to within 20 meters of Voss in the conference hall was a man who was genuinely, naturally, completely easy to miss. Not performing invisibility inhabited by it. He was medium height, medium build, with the particular forgettable quality of someone who had simply never needed to be noticed and had organized his entire existence accordingly. She understood him immediately, not with sympathy, with recognition. She knew what it looked like to move through the world without being seen. She had done it her entire career. The difference was that she had built her invisibility into a weapon and turned it towards something. Voss had built his into a shelter and turned it inward. She watched him for 11 minutes from a position that gave her a full read on his interaction patterns. Who he approached, who approached him, the duration of each exchange, physical tells of each conversation, the lean-in that indicated transfer of information, the slight repositioning that indicated the conversation was concluding, the particular stillness of a man who was listening very hard. He was running 3 conversations simultaneously, moving between them with the practiced timing of someone managing a schedule that nobody else could see. One of those conversations was with a man Emily didn't recognize from the intelligence file. She sent Garrett the description in real time through the team channel. Garrett's response came back in 4 minutes, not in the file. Running facial recognition now. 6 minutes later, no match in primary databases. Running secondary. 12 minutes, match in secondary. Low confidence match to an alias connected to a European financial intelligence flag from 14 months ago. Treat as unknown principal. Emily looked at Voss and the unknown man and understood, with the cold clarity that good operational instincts produce, that the timeline had just compressed again. Voss wasn't waiting for the conference to make his handoff. He was making it now. "Garrett," she said into the channel. "I need a conversation with Voss in the next 20 minutes. Casual, conference setting, nothing that registers as operational." Pause. "What's the pretext?" "Regional property management," she said. "He's a commercial real estate operator. It's the most natural conversation he can have at a business conference. You know enough about regional property management to—" "I grew up in eastern Tennessee," she said. "My uncle managed commercial properties for 30 years. I know enough." A shorter pause. 20 minutes is tight. "The unknown principal is walking away right now," she said. "Which means Voss is about to either follow him or take a break. I need to be in front of him before he decides." "Go," Garrett said. She moved. The approach was simple because simple was invisible. She crossed the conference hall at a pace that was purposeful, without being hurried, angling toward the coffee station near where Voss was standing, and she arrived beside him in the natural way that two people arrive at the same location, because the location was their destination, and not because either of them had engineered the proximity. She poured coffee. He glanced at her the way people glance at someone who enters their peripheral vision. She looked at his conference badge, a natural gesture, socially acceptable, the kind of thing people do at conferences. "Castellan Group," she said. "Regional or national?" He looked at her. The assessment in his eyes was practiced and fast. She caught it and recognized it for what it was, because she performed the same assessment constantly, just for different reasons. "Regional," he said. "Pacific Northwest primarily." "That's interesting," she said, with the genuine interest of someone who has a reason to be interested. "We've been looking at the Pacific Northwest market for about 18 months. Commercial lease environment. There has done something unusual in the last 2 years." He looked at her with slightly more focus. "Unusual how?" "The service contract layer," she said. "Most markets, that layer is where you find the slippage, the gap between what the property generates and what shows up in the ownership structure. Pacific Northwest has been unusually clean." Something moved behind his eyes. Extremely subtle, the kind of micro-response that most people would miss entirely. She didn't miss it. "You're in property management," he said. "Adjacent," she said. "Financial oversight. I look at the structures that hold properties rather than the properties themselves." She extended her hand. "Sarah Ellison." "Henrik Voss." "I know," she said. "I recognize the Castellan name from some work we looked at last year." This was the moment. The decision point where a man who had spent a career being invisible either retreated into that invisibility or engaged with the thing in front of him that appeared on its surface to be exactly what it was presenting itself as. He engaged, not fully, not with the openness of someone who had no caution, but enough. Enough to ask a question about the financial oversight work, enough to express a calibrated interest in the Pacific Northwest market analysis, enough to say, after 8 minutes of conversation that stayed precisely in the territory of things that were unremarkable, "We should continue this. Are you at the full conference or just today's session?" "Full conference," she said. "Then I'll find you tomorrow morning," he said. "There's a working group on regional commercial infrastructure at 900. It would be a useful conversation." "I'll be there," she said. She smiled at him the way Sarah Ellison would smile, professional, warm, slightly reserved, and moved away from the coffee station. In her earpiece, Garrett said very quietly, "That was extraordinary." She didn't respond. The 900 working group the following morning was where the operation's first major fracture appeared. Emily was in position at 840, Estrada was 3 chairs away, and Torres had confirmed audio coverage of the room at 832, and everything was in place with the kind of precision that good preparation produces. And then at 851, 9 minutes before the session began, OC sent a message through the secure channel that changed the temperature of everything. "Unknown principal from yesterday has been identified. High confidence match to a Dutch national with documented ties to 2 European intelligence services. He's not buying from Voss, he's here to prevent the sale." Emily read it twice. She sent back, "Prevent the sale to us or prevent the sale to a different buyer." OC unknown. "But he made 3 calls last night from a room adjacent to Voss's. Encrypted. We got the metadata, not the content. Duration suggests operational coordination, not social." Emily looked at the door of the working group room. Voss walked in at 857. He saw her, and something in his posture shifted the small, almost imperceptible change of a man who has located something he was looking for. He moved to a chair 2 seats from her, organized his materials, and waited for the session to begin with the patience of someone running a longer calculation than the room required. She sent one message to the full team channel: "Stay positioned." Do not move on Voss today. Repeat, do not move. We have a third party in play. Garrett confirmed. Emily, we let Voss talk to us. We find out what he knows about the third party, and then we decide. The working group session began. What happened over the next 4 hours was the most delicate operational work Emily had performed in 15 years of doing delicate operational work. Voss was intelligent. Not just functionally intelligent, structurally intelligent, the kind of person who builds frameworks for understanding situations rather than simply processing the surface of them. He had survived 2 decades in a network that regularly eliminated people who made mistakes. And he had survived it not through ruthlessness but through the particular survival skill of understanding the environment he was in more completely than the people around him. He knew the Dutch national was there. He told her this. Not directly. Nothing Voss communicated was direct, but in the careful, coded language of a man who needed to convey information without appearing to convey it, who needed a specific kind of help without appearing to need anything. A message decoded. I know someone is trying to stop the transaction. I don't know who sent them. I need the transaction to complete in the next 48 hours, or the window closes permanently. I will give you something significant in exchange for whatever protection you can offer. She received this and spent 40 seconds deciding how to respond. 40 seconds was a long time in that room. Then she said quietly, "The people who sent him, do you know which direction they're coming from?" Voss looked at her. "East," he said, one word, everything in it. She understood. The third party wasn't blocking the sale to protect the network. They were blocking it to protect a different buyer, one who had already made arrangements and did not want competition. The network had a second exposure she hadn't known about. She kept her face exactly neutral. "Give me until this evening," she said. Voss held her gaze for a moment with the specific attention of a man evaluating a bet. "This evening," he said, "after the dinner session. There's a terrace. I'll be there," she said. She stood and left the working group with the unhurried pace of someone whose morning had gone according to plan. And the moment she cleared the door, she walked directly to the nearest secured communication point and called Hayes. Hayes listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for exactly 5 seconds. "The second buyer," he said, "has existing access to at least part of the buffer layer," Emily said. "Voss is selling the upgrade, better access, cleaner architecture, more durable cover. The second buyer wants the upgrade and doesn't want anyone else to have it." She paused. "Which means if we let this play out the way Voss intends, we get Voss and his methodology, but the second buyer disappears with whatever access they already have. If you take Voss before the terrace meeting, the second buyer and the Dutch national both vanish before we can identify the source," she said. "We collapse one node and the rest of the network reroutes around it within 48 hours. Hayes was quiet again. "What do you need?" he said. "Authority to let the Voss meeting happen tonight," she said. "On our terms, not his. And I need Garrett's full technical capability active from 1800 onward." "You have it," Hayes said. "What else?" She paused. "I need Castillo positioned at the Dutch National's hotel exit," she said. "Things move fast tonight. I need someone who can follow without being followed." "Castillo," Hayes repeated, not questioning, confirming that he'd heard correctly. "He's ready," she said, a pause. "You're sure he's been ready since Redstone?" she said. "He just needed 18 days to know it." Hayes said, "Done." Terrace meeting at 2100 was the moment the operation either worked or it didn't. There was no middle outcome. Either Voss gave them enough to roll up the entire network, all 3 exposure layers, both buyer relationships, the Dutch national source, or he gave them something incomplete, and the rest disappeared into the particular darkness that sophisticated networks retreat to when they sense pressure. Emily arrived at the terrace 2 minutes before Voss. Juarez had audio. Garrett had the exits. OC was running real-time financial surveillance on 3 accounts associated with the buffer layer. Castillo was on the Dutch national, who had been in his room since 1900 and had made 2 calls in that time. Voss arrived exactly on time. He sat across from her and looked at her with the full, careful attention he had been calibrating since the coffee station yesterday, the look of a man who had spent 20 years reading people in high-stakes environments and was now applying that reading to the most important conversation of the last phase of his career. "You're not who you said you are," he said, not an accusation, an observation. Delivered with the calm of someone who had suspected this for some time and had decided after considerable deliberation that it didn't change his calculation. Emily looked at him steadily. "No," she said, "but you're not the people who sent Werner," he said. Werner, the Dutch national, named now for the first time in her presence. "No," she said, "then who are you?" She held his gaze. "People who can guarantee that Werner doesn't complete his assignment," she said, "and that the party who sent him doesn't receive what they're trying to acquire." She paused. in exchange for a complete accounting of the network's architecture. All 3 layers, both buyer relationships, Werner's source. Voss looked at her for a long time. Complete accounting, he said. Every layer, she said. No partial disclosure, no protected nodes, no carved-out exceptions for long-term relationships. Everything. And in exchange, she said, you walk away from this conference tomorrow morning, and you don't look back. He was quiet. In her earpiece she could hear Tora's breathing, could hear Garrett's almost inaudible presence on the channel, could hear, though very faintly, the sound of Castillo reporting from the Dutch national's position. Arnder is moving. He just left the hotel. She kept her face neutral. Werner is on his way here, she said to Voss. Not a guess, a statement. Voss's eyes changed. You have him covered, Voss said. I have everything covered, she said. That's the point. She leaned forward slightly. You spent 20 years being the most careful person in any room you entered. You built an exit because you understood that the network was going to collapse eventually, and you wanted to be gone before it did. She held his gaze. The exit is closing. Werner is the door shutting. I am the window that's still open, she paused, but windows close too. Voss looked at her. The terrace was silent. Then he said, I want it in writing. The arrangement. You'll have it in your hand before Werner reaches this floor, she said. Garrett's voice in her ear, very quiet, document is ready. She reached into her bag and placed a single folded page on the table between them. Voss looked at it for a moment. Then he picked it up. What followed happened in the compressed, accelerated time that real operations produce the kind of sequence where 18 days of preparation collapses into 40 minutes of execution, and the gap between all the planning and all the outcome is just the quality of the decisions, made in real time by real people under real pressure. Voss talked for 3 hours. He was thorough, methodical. He delivered the network's architecture the way a structural engineer delivers a building's blueprints, layer by layer, connection by connection, load-bearing elements first, secondary structures after. OC was on the channel for all of it, cross-referencing against the financial map in real time, confirming nodes, flagging discrepancies, building a picture that was, by the end of the 3rd hour, the most complete intelligence product on the network that any agency had ever possessed. Werner never made it to the terrace. Castillo tracked him to the elevator. When Werner stepped out on the wrong floor and found 2 people waiting, who were very politely and very firmly redirecting his evening, he made 3 decisions in rapid succession. He assessed the situation. He understood the situation, and he chose cooperation over resistance with the pragmatic efficiency of a professional who knows when a play has been called correctly against him. Werner's information added the final piece. The Eastern buyer, the second party trying to acquire Voss's upgrade, was an organization that 3 separate intelligence agencies had been trying to locate for 2 years. Werner had been sent not just to block the sale, but to identify who Voss was selling to, which meant Werner had been running his own operation inside the conference, which meant his cooperation gave Emily's team access to his entire intelligence chain. It was, as Garrett described it at the 200 debrief, a recursive gift. We went in for Voss, Garrett said. Voss gave us Werner. Werner gave us the Eastern buyer. The Eastern buyer connects to he stopped. This is going to take 6 months to fully unpack. And we start tonight, Emily said. He looked at her. She looked back at him with the same expression she'd had on the tailgate at Redstone Patient, clear, entirely unimpressed by the scale of what was in front of her. Tonight, he said. The window closes at day 4, she said. We use all of it. Hayes received the full preliminary report at 600 on day 4. He read it in the particular silence of a senior officer who has been in this work long enough to know that outcomes like this one do not happen by accident, and who understands, in reading the chain of decisions that produced the outcome, exactly where it pivoted. He made one call before the morning briefing, to Whitmore. Call lasted 6 minutes. Hayes said what needed to be said clearly and without editorial. The operation was complete. The team lead had performed at a level that would be documented in the program's record and referenced in its training curriculum. The events at Redstone that had preceded the mission, the decision at the range entrance, the evaluation, the after-action documentation had been reviewed at the program level and would inform restructuring of the evaluator selection criteria going forward. Whitmore listened. At the end, he asked one question. Is she aware that her insertion was designed specifically around the profile I failed to recognize? Hayes was quiet for a moment. She figured it out, he said. Pause on Whitmore's end. Of course she did, he said. Team came out of the operational window on day 4 afternoon, moving through the departure process with the quiet efficiency of people transitioning from mission mode to the particular decompression that follows high-stakes work. The shift from operational alertness to something more human took different amounts of time for different people. Torres was the fastest. He had a gift for compartmentalization that Emily had always admired. Osi took longer, still processing the financial architecture in a part of his mind he hadn't fully turned off yet. Castillo was quiet. He had been quiet since Werner, since the moment on the elevator floor when he had been required to make a real-time decision with real-time consequences and had made it correctly, and was still absorbing what that meant about who he was and who he was going to be. Emily found him in the team's staging area an hour before departure. "Werner," she said. He looked up. "You made the right call," she said. "I wasn't sure until I made it," he said. "That's what a right call feels like," she said. "If you were sure before you made it, it wasn't a real decision." She looked at him. "The uncertainty is the proof that the stakes were real." He was quiet for a moment at Redstone, he said. "When I asked Salinas why nobody said anything, I was really asking why I didn't say anything." "I know," she said. "I had the same 30 seconds everyone else had." "Yes," she said, "and I made the same call everyone else made." "You did," she said. "And then you asked the question that told me you weren't going to keep making it." She paused. "That's the part that matters, not the first 30 seconds. What you do with the 30 seconds after you realize you got it wrong." He looked at her. "You never got angry," he said, "about Redstone." "About Whitmore." She was quiet for a moment, genuinely considering whether to give him the managed answer or the true one. She gave him the true one. "I got angry a long time ago," she said. "I got angry enough, early enough, that I used it up before it could use me." She looked at him steadily. "I learned to do instead was stay clear, because clear produces outcomes and angry produces noise, and I was never interested in noise." He held this for a moment. "Is that what you told yourself on the tailgate?" he said. She almost smiled. "On the tailgate," she said, "I was reading the wind." Strada was the last person she spoke to before Wheels Up. They stood in the quiet of the departure area, and he looked at her the way he had looked at her 15 years ago, when she had made the shot that his report would describe as beyond the theoretical performance envelope, not with surprise, but with the particular satisfaction of someone whose understanding of what was possible has been confirmed rather than expanded. "Glasswall," he said. "Glasswall," she said. 6 months of unpacking, Garrett said. "At least," she said. "Hayes is going to want you for the next phase," Estrada said. "I know. Are you going to take it?" She looked at him. "You already know the answer," she said. He nodded. "I told Hayes," he said, 14 months ago, that the profile he needed for this mission was someone who had been invisible their entire career and had never stopped choosing what to do with that invisibility." He paused. "Every room where you were overlooked, every range where someone pointed at the gate, every evaluation where the 30-second judgment got it wrong." He looked at her directly. "You turned all of it into this." She held his gaze. "You taught me how to listen before I spoke," she said. "You already knew how," he said. "You just needed someone to tell you it was a skill and not a deficiency." The departure announcement came over the channel. She picked up her bag. Her rifle case, the old Pelican, scratched and repaired and carrying nothing cosmetic, was already loaded. She looked at Estrada one last time. "Thank you," she said. Not for the speech. For 15 years ago, for the class, for the word that had given her a framework for the thing she already was. He nodded once. She turned and walked toward the aircraft. And behind her, Raymond Estrada watched her go with the expression of a man who has spent a long career identifying the difference between people who are good at what they do and people who have become, through the accumulation of everything the world has thrown at them and everything they have chosen to do with it, something rarer and more durable than good. The aircraft lifted off at 1,600. Somewhere in the Redstone facility in Arizona, a range was preparing for the next evaluation cycle, and the evaluator selection criteria had been rewritten, and the document that had rewritten them bore Whitmore's signature alongside Hayes's. And the first line of that document read, "Operational capability does not announce itself." Evaluators' first obligation is to look past what they expect to see and recognize what is actually standing in front of them. Somewhere in a secured operations center, 6 months of network intelligence was being distributed to the agencies that would spend the next year acting on it, and the chain of decisions that had produced that intelligence began with a woman arriving at a range with an old rifle case and being pointed toward the gate. And somewhere at 30,000 feet, Emily Carter sat with her hands quiet in her lap and looked out at the sky and thought about nothing in particular. The way a person thinks about nothing when they have spent everything that was required and have no regrets about the spending. She had been underestimated her entire life. She had turned that into the most effective weapon she had ever carried. And every time the world had pointed her toward the gate, she had simply picked up her case, found the window that was still open, and walked through it patient, clear, and absolutely certain that the shot was there if she was willing to wait for the right conditions. She had always been willing to wait, and she had never, not once, missed.